So welcome back this afternoon to our third panel of this 10th annual conference of the Amsterdam Center for European Law and Governance. And I am very happy to start this panel with three distinguished speakers and an equally distinguished discussant. As I said already in the pre-talk that led us up to this discussion, we will give the audience time to interact with us. So make sure that you keep your questions at hand. My name is Christina Eckes, and it's my pleasure to chair this discussion where we're moving from migration and discriminations to really the market discussion, economy, what lies behind many of our questions that we have been asking in the past, or yesterday and this morning. But they will maybe come out even more clearly in the coming panel. So without much further ado, I will immediately move ahead and introduce the speakers to you. And then I will ask two questions and ask the speakers to share their thoughts on that, interact with each other, and then it will be your turn to ask all your pressing questions. So today on my panel, I have Diamond Ashiagbor, and she's professor of law at the University of Kent. And I think we are particularly grateful to have her to introduce a labor law perspective also in the discussion. So she has done a lot of work on social rights and the market and how to embed trade liberalism in regional labor law. Then we have Philomila Tsoukala, professor of law at Georgetown University. And here we hopefully get a bit of the family dimension, family regulation and welfare law, and of course, questions of the crisis. So how does crisis impact on social justice in the European Union? And finally, we have Damian Kukuwek, senior lecturer in law at Middlesex University in London. And his work connects, of course, very much to the question of core and periphery and how he has framed it in the past as a privilege to harm. So not so much a question of protectionism, but a question of privilege. And finally, and as a discussant intervening today, we have Gráinne, who we don't need to introduce to general EU law scholars. And I think that is also a perspective that she will bring to the table, namely the broad knowledge of principles and foundations of EU law, but of course also with her work on justice in the EU, or maybe why justice consideration are not so leading in the EU at times. And hence, without much further ado, I think in that order, I will give the word to the, I don't want to say presenters, but to the panelists of our round table. And I would first of all like you to address questions of what is the evolution of EU economic governance in relation to social justice issues? So what can we see as a development when we compare the different institutes of the European Union, but also the different perspectives taken over time in light of the austerity measures, in light of the Next Generation EU, in light of the Green Deal? What can we say is the general development? Can we see some form of a re-emergence of social Europe here? And I think I would first of all like you, Diamond, to take the Zoom screen.
Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you also to Ivana, of course, and supported by Alicia in organising this annual conference. So Ivana gave us a couple of prompts, a couple of questions to guide this conversation on the panel today. The first was, as Christina said, about the relationship between neoliberal ideology, austerity measures, new recovery, green transition. Are we witnessing the re-emergence of a social Europe? And she quite rightly, I think, put the words the letters re in brackets. Is it an emergence or a re-emergence? And I think some of us working in this area would say, have we really ever had a proper social Europe? My responses to this particular prompt very much connect with the responses I'm going to be given in a minute to Ivana's second set of prompts about centre, periphery, global north, global south. And hopefully you'll see why I think these two issues are connected. So obviously the EU is almost always facing a conundrum about identity. And the particular conundrum at the moment for me is, I'm going to be talking at the level of generality, is that the organisation of economic activity is transnational, but we are in this particular point where we're seeing a turn to populism, nationalism, even nativism. And that's one of the background conditions which is heightening a political shift to viewing the national level as the only legitimate level or site of regulation. So from my vantage point, I'm not after Brexit, I'm in the middle of Brexit, perhaps after Trump, we could say, but there's definitely this era of resurgent nationalism, and that definitely has an impact on legitimacy of bodies such as the EU as a source of transnational regulation. For me, the irony is that a significant source of legitimacy of EU action was precisely its ability to institutionalize markets which were no longer territorially bound, to embed markets, and to enable, to facilitate national democratic control over markets, over capitalism. But we've always had this historic imbalance at the level of the EU's economic constitution between the market and non-market objectives. And so that has really come to the fore in terms of not just jurisprudence of the Court of Justice, but more recently responses of EU institutions to, for instance, sovereign debt crisis, leading to a weakening of social and labour rights. So that plus judicial incursions against labour law and labour market institutions have exacerbated by broader EU economic policy governance contained, for example, in the European semester, with its focus on strict fiscal discipline, that subsumes, I think, and dilutes attempts to re-establish social Europe, even though we can see some glimmers of hope in the European pillar of social rights. And so I guess for me, I end up with a question, which is whether it's possible to have a counter response to what were, definitely very strong neoliberal responses to crises, and whether this crisis, the particular crisis we're living through at the moment of coronavirus pandemic, and the re-emergence of the nation state responses, whether that provides an opportunity for EU level responses to address what it means to construct a European polity that proceeds away from economic rationality towards social justice. So the coming out of the ashes of this current health emergency crisis, is that going to be something that galvanizes a recognition of the need to have the EU, if not being the substantive guarantor of social rights, then at least enabling and facilitating and not blocking the protection of social rights at the national level?
Yeah, many thanks for kicking that off and also connecting, in a sense, already the two prompts that I thought that Ivana wanted to do separately, but we can absolutely interconnect them. In many ways, they are, of course, interconnected. So maybe that is actually, I take your intervention also as a cue to exactly stress that you should feel free to also connect them immediately in your reaction. Maybe that is also, in the interest of time, a very good way forward. So how not only do we see economic governance develop, also in light of the health crisis, of course, but how do these structures as they exist interact with the unequal division of power? How do these structures of unequal division of power actually impact on any such development? So feel free to take both questions and address them together. Do you want to go ahead, Philomila, and
Sure.
start with,
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks, Diamond, and thank you, Ivana, for organizing and for inviting me to this really interesting panel. I'm really much more interested in hearing what everybody else has to say, but I'm honored to be here. So on the question of the evolution of economic governance and the degree to which social Europe has been integrated, there's obviously already a voluminous literature on the topic, and it seems that focuses on the European semester specifically. So translating the question of to what degree has social Europe been integrated into economic governance, as to what degree does the process of economic coordination through the European semester incorporate those concerns. And that literature seems to have converged more or less on the idea that there is a definite move towards a re-emergence of social Europe in the European semester. This seems to be, I mean, there's a lot of empirical work, and a lot of it seems to be, word counting really in the country-specific recommendations. Some of it is deeper and more qualitative, but there's a lot of also just counting words. And actually, there's also, some literature lately that is using machine learning to count words. And who can blame anyone for wanting to delegate the task of having to read the country-specific recommendations to machines? Like, truly, I think that's quite appropriate, actually. There's been a lot of work, qualitative work that also involves interviews with policy elites, national and EU-based. Now, to avoid being entirely facetious about this, let me say that there does seem to be a rhetorical shift towards more social language in the European semester. Scholars have even made distinctions between social Europe rhetoric that seems market reinforcing rather than rights-based, which would seem to make a distinction between, the substitution of a notion of social Europe as merely a means to an end, which is like a functioning market, versus a social Europe that guarantees a certain minimum decommodified core. So those two different concepts, some scholars have made a distinction between, and there even seems to be a shift in the rhetoric towards the, social decommodified minimum rather than the market establishing version of social Europe. Other accounts distinguish between the different positions of different member states in the political economy of the EU, and suggests a slightly more nuanced account in the sense that they track a core of recommendations, especially in the field of industrial relations in peripheral countries, as remaining biased towards liberalization, understood as having a bias against collective bargaining and the individuation of collective agreements in industrial relations, at least. So they identify a difference that's based on the different political economy position of different member states, with recommendations going in the direction of harder nudges towards liberalization for especially peripheral countries, and softer nudges towards core countries against their beggar thy neighbor policies. So notably the recommendations towards Germany that seem to be going not very far. Similarly, many actors, including trade unions, have placed great hope in the proposed minimum wage directive that may or may not see the light of day in spring of 2022. I'd really love to hear what others on this panel have to say about it. I'm curious to think what they think the chances of that happening actually are. And some place hope for that as a radical change in the EU politics towards away from the liberalizing reaction to the 2010 crisis, and then the Greek crisis that turned into a Euro crisis. Now, as I was writing this, I realized that I think that the more I concentrate on the question of social Europe and to what degree there is a turn towards social Europe, it seems to me that we would be missing the whole picture if we located economic governance these days within the four corners of the European semester, or maybe it's 5 corners. I don't know. It's a strange beast. And so more specifically, I would say it seems to me, and here's like my totally subjective and impression that I'm willing to research further and hear more about from everybody else. It strikes me that the political climate of the last 5 years suggests that it almost seems as if there's an informal agreement about an internal comparative advantage in the EU, and peripheral countries to the southeast for example, can be paid to keep out refugees. And that is a service that the core is willing to pay for, as opposed to continued support for failed fiscal policies of the failed South. Hence, Greece was threatened with a no deal on its economic package in 2015 when Germany's hospitality ran out. And all of a sudden, the waving through policy was transformed from a common agreement to a unilateral abdication of Greece's EU law-imposed duties. But in 2020, the Mitsotakis government's militaristic action against the refugees who had been trapped by Turkey's unilateral opening of its border towards Europe. They had been trapped in the land border, and the Mitsotakis government took militaristic action in early 22. That was hailed as a shield by von der Leyen on behalf of the EU. So that seems to me to not be a separate thing, but more and more becoming part of, so packages, crisis management packages in different fields seem to me to be becoming part of the core way in which the EU now deals with economic governance, quite, not quite apart from the European semester, but they're separate processes, but politically, I think they are interconnected. And I think everybody is probably thinking of them in tandem. Similarly, it seems to me that internal migration may start becoming more palatable than ever before in the midst of toxically xenophobic rhetoric, given the rise of nationalism that Damian was talking about. There may be a reconfiguration of the Polish plumber in the European North and his significance, since a Polish plumber definitely would strike the xenophobic rhetoric as a more palatable option than an Afghan plumber, certainly. So I'll stop here for the moment because I also made the connection between the two prompts, it seems to me. So I can say more about the family side of things, but I don't want to give a chance to everyone to do opening remarks, and I can come back.
Thank you. Thank you also for picking up on that link immediately. We're going to, in a second interaction, we're going to go also more specifically further on that question of North-South and these power divergences. Very interesting. I thought that you also made the link to the refugee crisis and the question of that this is an area in which we can clearly see a very strong limit, if you like, of social Europe. But I was wondering, I understood more from Damian that there's also some hope in the context of the pandemic, maybe, that is an area where we could have more willingness to integrate social Europe or social justice more than just rhetorically. So at least you left me with the strong sense, Philomila, that there's a lot of work done on the rhetorics and the changing rhetorics under the semester, but I understand from you that the actual implementation of social justice lags behind that rhetoric, if I understood you correctly. But let me give the word to Damjan, and then maybe later you have a chance to correct me in my understanding of what you said, because I think it is, of course, interesting to count words, as you say. I mean, to see what the rhetoric is changing and what the shift is changing, whether we can rhetorically protect a core that is, insulated, let's say, from commodification. But do we really have that in reality, or just in the rhetoric that we're building around it? Damjan, do you want to take the word and also see whether you either want to relate a bit to both questions, so the question of what is the trend in terms of social development? So do we have a situation of a re-emergence of social Europe? And maybe, if you like, immediately weave in your thoughts on center, periphery, north, global south, questions of does this reproduce unequal relationships? I think you still need to unmute, Damjan. I at least can't hear
Okay,
you.
so I was just thanking you now for half a minute and no one heard that. So wonderful to be here. I'm delighted, really. Thank you for having me, Ivana, for organizing, everyone involved. Just, Philomila, Diamond, wonderful comments. So, so I'll be a bit more abstract in the beginning and then probably later on explain, for the second prompt a little bit in more detail. I don't want to speak for too long, in one go. But let me say that. So I think the evolution generally, in recent years, definitely has been away from austerity. I think that is quite clear. And, this kind of a social policy is particularly important and welcome during the coronavirus crisis. I mean, if Europe now started with the austerity economic policy, it would quite clearly be a complete disaster. Now, and I think, when we speak about social policy and social Europe, I think I would limit understanding of what is a social Europe more in terms of tax and transfer. So basically more, increased expenditure politics. This is more social basically, and this should be welcomed generally because it's bound to affect, the weaker sections of society who are harmed by the market, obviously. So the weaker sections always need more support from the budget. But even this, more, a general critique of austerity, we have to be careful with that as well, because, can a country accumulate, or the European Union, debt endlessly? These are big questions, they're accumulating environmental debt as well. So long term, it's questionable, what the debt can do to our societies, and also to the weaker members of our societies in particular. Now, but what I want to highlight is that, these are some developments. I think the trend here is quite clear. But understanding the social Europe as, or a trend in social policy and economic terms, I think it's something different from understanding it in legal terms. And let me explain what I mean by that. So first of all, in law, when we're discussing, law is not an emanation of just of a particular, I mean, you cannot rationalize law in terms of particular economic policy. Law is casuistic. Law is changing all the time, and it's not just, an unfolding of an idea. I just don't buy that idea, that I'm afraid is underlying many of the discussions of the change in the legal system. And I think what is derived from this mistake is also that there's social justice on the one hand, and there's economic rationality on the other hand. That I think is just not true, right? I mean, we can speak of social justice, in many different respects. And I've seen this development in competition law, where people wanted to infuse competition law with fairness. But, did this really help the unprivileged? I haven't seen any proof of it whatsoever. Actually, I've been proving, actually I've been proving the opposite, and I'll get to that in the second prompt. So I don't think economic rationality and social justice should be seen as, two conflicting ideas that are sort of playing out in the legal system. No, I think we should change our economic rationality, and we should change our social justice thinking. I know I've discussed that in the book chapter, Taking Change Seriously, the rhetoric of justice and the reproduction of the status quo. It's a book chapter in a book, Europe's Justice Deficit, edited also by Gráinne, the Búrca, who's here. So I think, seeing economic rationality as something inherently evil and wrong is just, it's not serious. It's just analytically not right. Okay. So, and seeing social justice as something perfect and wonderful. My take always is phenomenological. Justice is phenomenological, and that's what I'm discussing also in that paper. We have to see how all these particular policies play out in any particular case, in any particular situation. So, I'm very skeptical about, justice talk is inherently good, and I'll explain more about that in the, in the center-periphery relationship. This is very, very visible. So maybe just one sentence, and then I'll shut up, and I can come back to the specificities later. So, what is social for the center may not be social for the periphery, right? Because because workers of the periphery, companies of the periphery, are in a different hierarchical situation in the production of goods, services, etc. So you know, taking one policy or one approach is somehow benefiting everyone, although they're in a radically different social situations, and labeling this approach as social is just, it cannot stand, right? Because someone is always privileged, no matter how we regulate. So, and choices have to be made, and we have to see legal choices in context, phenomenologically, not in terms of large ideological battles. I don't think it's analytically right to see the discussion of change in law in terms of large ideological battles. I just don't think it can lead to the good solutions. It's even, I would say, even irresponsible to some extent. So now I'll shut up. Thank you.
Thank you, Damjan. I don't think the question was meant really to say that we should exclude economic rationality, or in a sense of demonizing economic rationality, but I think I would like to give the word back to Philomila, who I thought actually agreed with the, you said mainly rhetorical, but with establishing a minimum of a, I think you spoke of a decommodified core or decommodified part. So I'm wondering to what extent, to what extent would you say that that is actually, that there is a part that should not be subject to economic rationality? Was that what you wanted to imply with that, or?
Well, no, I actually don't understand the two as separate. So I'm not sure, who Damian is addressing specifically. I understand, I think everybody understands on this panel that, the two are deeply interconnected. The thing is that I do think that, so my point was there's a definite rhetorical shift. As to the practice, the stuff that traditionally has been understood by many people to belong to a core of social Europe, the jury is still out on the implementation of that rhetoric through the country-specific recommendations, and whether that process is translating into reforms that are in a specific direction or another. Personally, I have analyzed that change through the lens of the different types of welfare regimes that different member states have, and have I've argued in the past that basically it's, unless you take into account the type of welfareism, whether that is the family just internalizing the dependency costs, even when on paper it looks like you have a welfare state, which is the case with lots of the peripheral countries, including Greece, to some extent, Italy, Spain, Portugal. They all came to the table with welfare regimes that looked one way on paper, and in reality, basically a regime of the family and the household internalized dependency costs. So then you get the layer of the EU regulation that assumes a kind of like a core minimum of social Europe, and that means that effects are actually going to look very different on the ground depending on what that background regime is. So I think that so far I myself have not been able to see, certainly the countries that have been managed through crisis management for the Euro crisis, there was a definite tilt in those reforms. And then the idea was that basically you need to keep your costs down if you're going to stay in the monetary union, because you don't have any more fiscal space, and you can't get out of the union, or you don't want to get out of the monetary union, and therefore this is the only way. So I would say, but I agree with Damian that we need to look at perhaps he's using a different kind of lens, but I'm trying to broaden the focus and say, in the past I've said, we still don't know which way on the ground these things will go, even though the countries that are under fiscal constraint, definitely a tilt there in terms of how these things are going on the ground. And then my point was that other stuff is becoming part of regular economic governance. And as a hypothesis, I am putting out there the idea that perhaps European elites have started thinking that the unmanageable EMU with all these different countries can become more manageable, not by insisting on core reforms to core institutions that they understand as core for the market, but rather some kind of redistribution through different packages that are, addressing the refugee crisis or green Europe, which everybody seems to want, or what have you. So that, like, the package management of economic governance is what I was pointing to.
Yeah, thank you for that. Diamond, I don't know whether you want to come in. I saw you agreeing or disagreeing. I think I will just give you the word to come in on what you want to come in rather than.
I really appreciate what Philo's been saying now and earlier, and especially your mention of the proposed directive on minimum wages. And I think that's really interesting and very much speaks to what you're saying about the change in rhetoric. So what I find really interesting about this proposed directive is two aspects. One is, at first sight, you'd think, how is it possible that the EU has competence to propose and enact a directive on minimum wages? Doesn't, the treaty, section 153, there's a tension there because it seems to exclude competence for the EU to set minimum wage. And in fact, what you have is a proposal for adequate minimum wages in the European Union. So it's very much, and this is the kind of story of the social dimension of the EU anyway, it's acknowledging that it is the individual member states which are responsible for the social transfers. And so it's a kind of classic thing that we see in labour law, especially international labour law or trade agreements. So if you think back to the old NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement between the US, Canada and Mexico, what that did to retain sovereignty of those countries in the free trade area was to say each country will enforce its own labour law. So this is something similar to what this directive is doing. It's saying each member state, so the directive will establish the sort of basic minimum, the directive will establish the framework within which member states set their minimum wages and that they have to be adequate. And of course, adequate is different from minimum. So it's very much not achieving a substantive outcome. It's a classic labour law move of setting the procedural framework within which social partners, national trade unions and employers associations can operate. So I think that is a sign of some kind of shift away from, as Damjan said, there's a shift away from the austerity sort of dominance. But I do think I want to come back to this kind of broader, if you kind of zoom out, a broader question, which is, I find it really useful. Wolfgang Streeck has a fantastically pessimistic take on the European Union, which I agree with this first stage, but not his conclusion. The first stage is that he asks, is the post-war marriage of democracy and capitalism at an end? And I think I would answer that question with the observation that, so is democracy compatible with market fundamentalism? And to me, the answer, the role of the European Union and amongst this selection of global north states is that in the post-war era, democracy was compatible, market fundamentalism was compatible with democracy through an embedded liberal bargain, in that the EU was very pivotal in enabling states to shield themselves from the kind of more financialized, disembedded capitalism that the EU was responsible for helping states to maintain their distributive potential from the worst aspects of free markets. Some of those worst aspects of free markets were exacerbated by the internal market process itself. And so if the EU withdraws from its sometimes role in supporting such state capacity, that will make it much more difficult to maintain democratically determined collective values and institutions, which is why something like this proposed directive on adequate minimum wages is so important, because it's signalling a return to the role of the EU in providing the parameters within which it's the states that do the substantive change, but they can't if they are unable to shield their own economies from entirely mobile, financialized, disembedded capitalism.
I think, do you want to react in any way, Damjan, to that? Because I think in a sense that connects to the question of to what extent economic rationality, and I mean, here we hear a shielding. You basically say it's not so much about protectionism, autonomy, but here is a suggestion of, can the European Union actually enable member states to protect an embedded liberal internal bargain from what you call the financialized, disembedded culture outside? So do you have any reaction to that, Damjan, or shall I? Yeah,
I don't have any particular reaction to that, because I mean, I see, frankly, I mean, to my mind, and maybe it will be clearer when I speak about, the cases, but I don't see these questions as being, just large conceptual questions of, what are the possibilities of the European Union to do on the, internally in member states and vice versa. I mean, these are very conceptual questions, and I frankly, I don't know what good can come out of this very large, very broad ideological debate. I just don't see it, but maybe I'm missing something.
But maybe move forward to speak about a case that you.
Okay, so yes, absolutely. And, same with the, minimum wage directive. So it all sounds wonderful. We all want workers to have higher wages, but, how does this affect the periphery? Who knows, right? Because quite clearly, it's obviously the higher the wages in the periphery, the less competitive it is, right? So, but I'll come later with my example. So I don't want to go too much into this debate. It's very political, very interesting, but very questionable consequences of this seemingly very positive development.
But if your example is, no, I mean, if now is the moment, if your example is to
okay, all right,
your
so
argument,
let me give you another example. Let me give you another example, right? Let me give you another example. Not going to this directive too much. I just don't want to for several reasons. But I'll give you another example. So, and that is a reaction, partial reaction. I can speak about this for hours to the second prompt. So you all remember the Laval saga, right? It was the end of social Europe when the Court of Justice decided that, the Swedish trade unions cannot block, a company bringing in cheaper workers to Sweden from Latvia in that respect. So basically Latvia from the periphery, Sweden, a country of the center. So what happened as a result? The Posted Workers Directive was amended. It was amended in the, it was amended basically based on the arguments, we need a more social Europe, a more just Europe, this is just not right. So it was amended basically in two respects. Before under the old directive, so basically a company coming into the host country had to abide by minimum wage in the host country, all right? If that minimum wage was set in a universally applicable collective agreement or in a statute. Now, this was amended in a way that a company has to basically pay the same remuneration as it is paid in the host country. So that is clearly much less favorable to companies of the periphery. Okay, very damaging in several respects to companies of the periphery. And then there was another major change because obviously, the minimum wage in, let's say in Sweden and, Latvia is radically different. So a worker in Latvia who would be otherwise unemployed would be very happy to get, minimum wage in Sweden for whatever work they might do. So the alternative, basically, I mean, I was very much in favor of Laval because I think people misunderstand that posting of workers is basically, they don't see it as an exportation of unemployment, but it really is, right? The periphery has much higher unemployment than the center in many, cases, and it is less developed. I won't go into those details. So basically reducing the comparative advantage of the companies of the periphery is just harmful to the periphery, and the Posted Workers Directive was changing this perspective in this way, and in the name of social Europe. That's what I keep saying. So we really have to see what the particular legal specific developments mean on the ground. So another thing that was changed was after 12 months, posted workers, they can build airports that, take years to build, right? But after 12 months, or in some cases after 18 months, basically the local labor law of the host country applies to posted workers, which again makes the companies of the periphery and their workers less competitive. And basically, I was asked by some MEPs to give my opinion in the European Parliament, and we had, I think, a 2-hour discussion of what that actually means for peripheral workers, for the vested interests and so on. But in the end, it was all rejected in the name of more social Europe. So that's what I'm saying. We have to be careful what we wish for when we speak about social. And yeah, so I can go into more detail. I can also speak more about center periphery if you wish me to. But let me just say that I think that the missing angle of the law of the center and the periphery is the most destabilizing element of the European Union's existence. I truly believe that, because the policies, the periphery is getting empty. We have to be aware of that. I mean, the Romanian finance minister the other day said, we cannot compete on the European market. We just cannot. Let's be very frank. We're discussing this in Amsterdam now. We're not discussing this in Belgrade or Ljubljana or Athens, So there is a problem. There's a big problem. And it is just not, the parliament that actually adopted this posted workers directive I saw the other day is now saying, well, there's a huge brain drain from the periphery. Of course, there's brain drain from the periphery because it doesn't have enough economic opportunities to get developed. And let's help periphery and let's build more infrastructure and let's, let's give people access to internet and better transport. And what can you do with the internet if you're unemployed? Nothing very productive, right? If you don't have possibilities on the ground to develop, I mean, all the infrastructure and airports don't help much, right? I mean, people can basically leave the periphery sooner or, maybe, come back for the weekend. So I think it's really stabilizing that whatever economic policy is implementing is just the extreme unprivileged position of the periphery is just not taken into account. And connected with that, I think, it's coming up in a book. My very good friends from Zagreb are preparing a fantastic book, and I'm contributing a chapter on that. I think that the current rule of law crisis actually has something to do with it. I think this is what is going on now with the rule of law. It's really it's not just the rule of law crisis. It's a crisis of rejection of common values. It is terrible, and I think it is a radicalized. I think what we're seeing now is really some sort of a radicalized rejection of everything European. And I think that in some countries, I won't even name them, not necessary. In the European Union, who were 15 years ago, if we look back, uncritically accepting everything that came from the European Union, and today uncritically rejecting everything that's coming from the European Union. It's very sad, very immature. It's just a terrible situation, I find. But I think the problem is that the common values are somehow falling apart, and I think the fact. I mean, obviously, I don't know the details of what is going on in particular countries in the European Union. I don't know, let's say Hungary in detail. There's complex internal situations why things are developing the way they are. But
yeah,
and now I'll shut up. But I think this really has to do something with the developments. But we can talk more. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Damian. A strong argument that be careful what you wish for. Social Europe must pay attention to the center periphery link, as you call it. So the question of what are the consequences in the periphery. I think there are also thoughts. I saw Philomila, I think, reacting to it on screen, but maybe for the moment, I would like to ask Gráinne to come in and maybe ask some more probing questions on these issues to facilitate further discussion. And anything that you haven't been able to say in relation specifically to the second prompt to the dimension, I think we will get back to you in a moment where you can see how you could further fit that in. Gráinne.
Thanks, Christina. So that was a fascinating discussion. I had prepared some questions based on the written comments that the panelists had submitted in advance, but the conversation has branched out in lots of different directions as well. So, I mean, maybe just to start with that last point that Damjan made, that, you know, the questions and the focus of the panel, as I understood it in the, you know, the written materials, was on economic governance, and particularly on this, you know, traditional sort of imbalance, what Diamond described as the embedded liberal bargain of the EU, where economic liberalization would take place at transnational level, and then the welfare policies and distributive policies and so on. I won't call them social, because of Damian rightly warning us, don't distinguish between the social and the economic, but let's say the more distributive policies taking place mainly at the domestic level, and you know, the EU enshrining kind of a strong commitment to economic liberalization, that's the bargain, or that's the model we were thinking about. What have its implications been? Is it, you know, too neoliberal now? Look at the austerity Europe we've endured and so on, and thinking about that, and whether it would be possible to think beyond it. That's how I understood, anyway, the questions Ivana put to us of reimagining, you know, Europe. So some of my questions were geared towards that. But maybe just before I articulate the questions I had in mind. So Damian brought in at the very end something that, you know, wasn't in the discussion otherwise, and not really in the, as far as I understood it, in the program for the conference. But what's the relationship between current political illiberalism and economic liberalism? So these are two kind of trends that are two developments, and I find it difficult to relate them. They're complex, as Damian says, but I think it's interesting, and I think we should think about them. Is there a relationship between political authoritarianism, as we see it developing in many parts actually of the EU, not just in the states that are usually pinpointed, on the one hand, and then economic liberalism on the other hand? But maybe just to step back from that for a moment. So I think, you know, Diamond and Philo brought forward, you know, I won't say a terribly grim picture, but you know, a picture of, well, not much has changed here. We're still, in fact, if anything, the original, you know, economic liberalism at EU level and distributive policies at national level bargain has shifted more and more in the direction of stronger and stronger economic liberalization rules and fiscal discipline rules and so on, that shrink the scope for different policies, different types of social policies at the domestic level. And I think Ivana had asked us, but is that changing now, you know, with the recovery fund and so on? And I think Philo's answer is not really. It looks maybe superficially. Diamond looking more at labor law reforms, thinking maybe, you know, maybe we have something, but, you know, it's still, and I think maybe in your written remarks too, Diamond, you focused on the sort of colonial dimensions or post-colonial dimensions of how the EU functions. So those were fairly, I thought, I won't say bleak, but grim enough analysis of where we are. Damian's comments are more in the direction of thinking, well, you know, whatever social is, isn't uncontested in the same way that whatever economic governance isn't uncontested. So to talk about more social Europe means which kind of social policy and who gets harmed and who gets benefited by those. But certainly, I think there's a strong perception and maybe reality that you know, the balance between strongly economic liberalization policies, rules, and law, to come back to Damian's distinction between the law and the politics, is very entrenched at EU level and hard to shift, and that it's not shifting much at present. And so that the shrinking scope for different varieties of welfare at the domestic level is not getting any better. The space is not growing and is, if anything, shrinking. So I just wanted to, because the questions in the conference was about reimagining, and I know you had some sessions earlier about teaching EU law, and I guess I was thinking about it as more of what to say to the future Europeans that you're teaching, what kind of Europe are they entering? What kind of Europe are we occupying? And what, if anything, can be done? So I always have a valency for trying to think about possibilities for reform or pragmatic suggestions. And maybe that doesn't always, that might seem sometimes a bit at odds with a critical perspective, because in order to really understand what's happening, you have to be, really sharp-eyed in your criticism. But just thinking about whether there is room for reform, and maybe that's where I'll direct my questions. So to just accept the critiques that have been put forward, even though there's clearly disagreement on them. And I think the discussion between Damjan and Philo is a good example of that. But at the same time, let's assume that things are really imbalanced, if we use that term, at EU level, and that economic disciplines are making it very difficult for states to deliver on adequate welfare policies for their different citizens, and to realize different forms of social justice. So, if we go back to, this is such an old framework, but it's always helpful, to the Hirschman exit voice loyalty, the three options, and I'm sure there are many more within those, but are generally, okay, you could do as the UK did and exit. And there are other forms of exit possible within that, opt-outs and so on, opt-outs from EMU, as some states have taken, and other kinds of opt-out. It used to be opting out from social policy too. Those allow for more choice, and those allow for more scope for domestic maneuver. And then there's loyalty. And as I understood Philo's description of what's happening in Greece, that's really a version of sort of maybe reluctant loyalty, just that it doesn't seem to be that there's the option to challenge or question. So you stay silent, you accept it. And I liked your term guerrilla warfare that you used in your written comments, but the idea that, states get around these disciplines in different ways. So not all the disciplines bite equally hard, and it's possible for states to nonetheless manage to provide the kinds of policies they want, even within the constraints provided. But mostly it's loyalty, it's silence, it's accepted this is the EU that we have, we can't do much, we're on the periphery or we're in the south. But the middle one is voice. And so there's a multiple different sort of kinds of voice, I suppose, that could be exercised. And that's maybe where I'd focus my questions for those of you who are, starting out on your careers or thinking about, what kinds of interventions to make and so on. Where might be the possibilities for the pressure points, the possibilities for change, for reform? I won't say who's to blame, but where's the responsibility for the production of the EU's particular kind of economic model? And like in some of the recent scholarship I was reading, different people locate it differently. So Streeck, maybe also Sharp, and I'm trying to think, that's Dieter Grimm would say, the court, the commission, the supranational actors are really responsible. The legal framework has been constitutionalized in this inappropriate way. But others, and I think Nicholas Mulder was one who said, who's really responsible for neoliberalism at the EU level? And he said it's member state governments. He said even the centre left and socialist governments, they lined up behind this agenda, and they haven't taken the opportunity to try to change it. So, that would suggest look at national governments and politicians at domestic level, and that's where the mobilization or advocacy or has to happen. Dieter Grimm and Sharp would suggest have to reform the Court of Justice, have to reform the constitutional rules on the internal market, for example. And then I think Bojan Bogaric suggests, well, it's oddly in some ways, but maybe appropriately, he says, no, it's the left that's to blame. The left in Europe is to blame. So they don't want to mobilize at European level. So they accept this embedded idea where it's, left-wing policies you pursue domestically, the rest you leave to the EU. They don't want to move the debate, the struggle, and so on to the European level. Maybe Varoufakis being one of the few exceptions who thinks you've got to do it at European level, or else it's not going to work. So I just want to put that out there as a question: where are the points? Where would be the appropriate points for trying to push for reform? Because different actors, depending on how they see the problem, see the entry points and the responsible actors and the actors who can make a difference as being in different places. And I'll finish with just to pick up maybe 3 or 4 points of where there might be some openness in the current, where maybe it's less economic model that the EU has sort of developed, and that seems to have been going, and I think I agree with this, in an increasingly rigid direction, where there's just less room for national social policy, varieties of national social policy, and more stricture at the EU level. I see it less in the internal market rules and the role of the court, and more in the EMU and economic governance framework, but it's probably, there's some combination of those two. But so one thing is, okay, we're in the COVID era, and again, Ivana asked us to think about this. Has it made a difference? So the Stability and Growth Pact has been suspended, right? Has that made a difference? The suspension of these core, rules, does that allow an opening for saying, well, maybe not just suspension, let's rethink? And even Mario Draghi recently was talking about, well, it's not time to return to those disciplines yet. So again, we're in a period where there's room for rethinking, even if, as Philo rightly said, oh, this is all emergency governance, this is all extraordinary governance, everything's all, but maybe extraordinary governments can become a space in which other kinds of possibilities emerge. The second, obviously, is the recovery fund. We haven't talked much about it. What are the implications of that? How strict are these, what are the plans emerging like? Is there strong sort of pushes towards structural reform or not? Is there room for, as Philo said, the guerrilla movement domestically in different ways? So, what about that? The new labour law reforms that Diamond talked about, and again, I see Diamond and Damjan maybe differ on those, but and also The Economist this week, I don't know if you saw, Diamond, has a very different view of those rules than the one you presented. I think that would make, you should write into The Economist and push back against their perspective on that, but also for platform workers. So, there are some elements emerging at the EU level now, and maybe some kind of response to the crisis in Europe at the EU level, that there might be room there for advocacy and intervention. And then finally, no, not finally, second, penultimate, something nobody's mentioned and is kind of tragically under the radar, but the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is going on and has brought together all these citizens panels and so on. Nobody, I mean, it's as low profile as anything has ever been at EU level. And again, that's very odd. Why is it that this opportunity for some kind of rethinking and change involving, citizens selected by sortition and so on is so invisible? And again, I read an article yesterday that suggested it's the fault of the states. The governments don't want these things Europeanized. They don't want the idea that things can be improved at EU level. There's again that a double two-level game that states play. So, that's another question. Is there any scope for doing something to highlight what's happening at the Conference on Future Europe, to know what's going on there, to input into it, and to make it more relevant and visible? And finally, Damian's point about law isn't fixed, it's casuistic. So there's always room for reinterpretation. And I think Clemens Kaup always makes this point as well. The EU isn't by nature in some essential way neoliberal. Law is always open to contestation and development and so on. So those are just some suggestions for places where, we might think about pressure points or points where change might be imagined. And I'll stop there because I promised I wouldn't speak and I've spoken for too long.
Many thanks, Gráinne, many thanks. You asked us for institutional or maybe procedural pressure points. Where could these changes come in? And you gave us already 3 pointers where that could be the case. So I'm not sure who of the speakers would want to jump on either of them. I really want to keep it open and see what you would like to also react to. There's no need to address all three, but I think it would be nice if you could relate a bit to this question of, so how can we reimagine it? How can we move forward? What could be ways in moving towards the maybe even contested, but somehow seen as right direction, as the direction of more social justice? So I think that would be a great question to engage with. And I see Diamond jumping up and down, so you get the word first.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Gráinne. I really appreciate and like what you were saying about the opportunities or the potentials for rethinking that are offered in the context of crisis governance or emergency governance could be then crystallized. So it's not just, the crisis enables a new way of thinking, which might then form a sort of different way of working. And so I was thinking about 2 or 3 crises: sovereign debt crises, the migration refugee crisis, and the pandemic. And so the pandemic has led to all kinds of rethinking. So unexpected sources like the Financial Times would say at national level, perhaps we need to be thinking about universal basic income as a response to the pandemic has made us rethink what work is. So there's all kinds of responses to the pandemic. That the first response has been a sort of healthcare response. We need to save people's lives, but then it does also require us to rethink our institutions. But I was going back to the emergency governance or crisis governance, which emerged as in response to the sovereign debt crisis. There was something really curious going on. And you were saying, I think I really agree with you, that who's to blame for the neoliberal dominance of neoliberal thinking at EU level? It's the individual member states, because if you look at the responses to those countries, those states which were receiving financial support from the Troika, the European Commission, the Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, there was a real similarity, there was a real learning on the part of the IMF from the, for example, structural adjustment programs implemented by the IMF and the World Bank in an earlier era directed at developing states from the 1970s onwards. So you had a sort of similarity between the sort of, basically sort of structural adjustments, but imposed on Greece rather than the sub-Saharan African states. So those techniques of neoliberal governance, which came out of the need to respond to an emergency economic crisis, were applied to the kind of countries of the global north and the EU, but having first been trialed on the global south. And I see that those emergency responses have in fact been quite entrenched. And it will be interesting to see whether the proposals for the recovery fund, the emergency responses to the pandemic, can equally lead to a change in the sort of center of gravity as to the balance between the economic and the social, in the way it seemed to have led to a change in center of gravity, the economic governance response to the sovereign debt crisis. So that would be interesting. Right? Governing in an emergency can sometimes just become the default form of governing.
Philomila, I see you also.
Yeah, I mean, this is,
at least in your face to the.
Yeah, I'm thinking these are really a compelling set of questions, and I'm always on the side of pessimism, and probably that tells you something about more about me than how about the situation is. But like having someone you can count on for a specific type of analysis, I think, is useful for everybody else to use as a sounding board of. And so I always get stuck on the question of reform and where is the possibility for transforming, because I'm much more focused on, perhaps like Diamond, identifying continuities in ideological projects that then seem to me to translate, to limit the possibility of actual reforms on the ground. And so in that sense, I will admit that kind of analysis has limitations. On the other hand, I want to point to the idea that, as Damian pointed, there's no, basically the social Europe itself perhaps has an specific ideological construction, but then paradoxically, you also seem to make a very sharp distinction between the political and the economic. And I wanted to, kind of like challenge you on that, because, like your analysis of the case of the posted workers, like in terms of the costs to, like the workers in the East, we can put that in an ideological framework as well. Like you could approach that through a lens of economic theory, which is not itself neutral, like on the workers in the East gets us out of the conundrum of then what frame to use to think about the solutions. Now, I think that there is, perhaps to try and go against a little bit my own impulses of pessimism, I'm going to really try hard and see where the opening might be. And so thinking about also a question that came up from Piotr Kraszewski, sorry for butchering your name, about whether there might be a package management that might lead to more positive results. So the reasons why I'm there may be, but I kind of see certain rhetorical frames as becoming entrenched over time. Part of the reason why package management of a green union, for example, or green energy, let's say, or refugee management becomes possible is because there's political opening for agreement, partly because some of the entrenched ideological positions do not get challenged. For example, you can include Greece in that because, well, we haven't done anything wrong really in terms of, specifically polluting the planet. We also need to turn to green energy. Everybody needs money for that adjustment. We are getting an unfair share of the refugee flow. We're not at fault like we used to be with the crisis management. So I can see ways in which the rhetorical frame of the previous crisis can become entrenched in the new, can remain unchallenged by the new packages. Perhaps the only possibility of opening I see is if the digitization of public sector actually manages at some level to unleash some kind of productive capacity that wasn't there before. Perhaps that can turn into something interesting. If that doesn't happen, the Greek government certainly seems to think that all we need to do is show people that the internet works and we have great beaches, and everybody with a startup will then move to the islands to work from there the year long, and we can become not the Florida of the EU, but some kind of better space where we can integrate, not by actually necessarily changing core productive capacities, but allowing people to move around just because the internet works. So I don't know, I'm not offering a very coherent answer. These are just random thoughts because I'm really pushing myself against a certain kind of pessimism that comes from it's dispositional, but also that allows me to see certain rhetorical patterns persisting. And those rhetorical patterns, I think, have an impact on how actual reforms on the ground can work. So the rhetorical piece, materially speaking, again, let me just use the example of Greece. Nothing. There's one really positive thing that has come out of the crisis, which was actually the insistence on the creation of a minimum. It's not a minimum income, but there is much more uniform state support for the poorest of the poor, and that is the first time that happens. That has to be acknowledged. On the other hand, it's not redistributive enough for any of the basic structures to have changed. The Greek family still holds the main locus of internalizing dependency of the young, of the old, of the poor. There's nothing much that has changed in terms of productive capacities, and the project of doing so through projects of green energy in the case of Greece still get translated into the 2 to 3 actors that dominate the market get to grab those projects, internalize the profits, and redistribute down through just the family household context that we even had before. So I will fully accept my role as the dark oracle here, fully aware that that cannot all be true, but in the hopes that maybe it can help the rest of you use some of that as a sounding board for clarifying better positions for the future.
Thank you. I think a very important point at the end, the question of center-periphery relations, not just between member states, but also certainly between economic actors and who benefits from what and where in what way. I think that's a very important point, because I don't think we should just stay at the member state level. I think that is also a simplification that is problematic in many regards. I will give you the word, Damjan, but I'm asking you immediately to be very brief, and please keep that in mind, because I then really want to revert to the audience, not just in the chat, but also ask people to raise their digital hands in the event that they want to ask a question.
This is really brutal because there's so many points, right, that have been raised. So, okay, I'll just try to address a couple. So, first of all, Philomila, I don't see how you think I'm making the how I'm distinguishing the political from the economic. Obviously it's all I don't distinguish it at all. So maybe I said something that just wasn't correct, because the only thing that
forget it. Let's just move on.
Okay, let's move on. Okay, yeah. The only thing I am interested is, in effect, consequentially, the policies we devise, no matter what we call them, what effect do they have on the periphery? And I've been researching this question for years, and I've seen so many policies which are negative for the periphery that no one cares about. They're just not a part of the discourse about the social Europe. I also constructed a doctrine on dumping, how companies of the center can actually dump goods on the periphery. It's quite complex, and we don't have the time to go into it. But they have such fabulous means to destroy the peripheral industry. It is quite, and it is happening. It is happening before our eyes, and no one quite cares about that. It's just not a part of discussion about social Europe. And who's responsible for that? I think it's an intellectual responsibility of all of us, I think, as well. And I think this discussion about social Europe is really captured by 2 or 3 German thinkers to a huge extent, who are being brought up at every corner whenever this is discussed. And there's so many dimensions which I think are radically destabilizing the European Union. I'm really convinced about it, and this is possibly the last point. I mean, there's so many things to say, but also to what Gráinne said earlier, I really think that this political authoritarianism that we're dealing with now has something to do with economic frustration. I am convinced about it. And actually, again, I don't have the time to go into it. I explained that in the article. There's a strong link. There always has been a link. Economic frustration was always in history a reason for political authoritarianism. And I think we are there now. And everyone's treating the rule of law crisis. So how do we force Poland to do that? And these are important questions, of course. But the underlying problem is much, much deeper, in my opinion. Okay. One last thing, teaching is very important, but the problem is also, students, that's another question. Some students are interested in that and some in other things, but it's an intellectual responsibility. It's a collective responsibility of all of us. And where do you start? I don't have a good answer to that. It's a question of strategy. Okay, so let's maybe leave